The chaos of the airport buzzed like static in the air. A familiar blend of urgent footsteps, rolling suitcases, and half-hearted announcements crackling through overhead speakers. Among the flow of travelers making their way toward Gate A17, Rick Stenson stood out. Not just because of his tailored charcoal blazer and the designer loafers polished to an arrogant gleam, but because of the way he held himself with the self-satisfied posture of a man used to getting what he wanted. A seasoned investment banker with 2 decades of wealth behind his condescending smirk. Rick was a regular in first-class cabins and made sure everyone around him knew it. As the boarding call for first class echoed through the terminal, Rick slipped off his sunglasses and strutted toward the front of the line, scanning the waiting passengers with the bored disdain of a man judging a lineup of used cars. That's when he saw him, someone who didn't fit the mold, at least not by Rick's standards. A black man, tall, athletic build, dressed casually in a simple gray hoodie and joggers, was already standing in the first-class queue, earbuds in, eyes focused forward. Rick's lip curled the way it always did when he felt someone was playing a system he thought he'd mastered. He slid in beside the man, adjusted his Rolex, and leaned in just enough for his sarcasm to be heard without being overt. First class, huh? Must be some kind of mistake, unless they're letting influencers in now, he muttered, half laughing to himself. The man didn't flinch. No reaction, no response. Just a calm exhale as if Rick's words dissolved into the air like background noise. That only irritated Rick more. He expected a comeback, a defensive look, maybe even an apology, the kind he was used to extracting when he questioned someone's place. But nothing. That silent confidence gnawed at him. As the line moved forward and the boarding agent scanned the mystery man's ticket with a polite smile and a welcome aboard, Mr. Jordan, Rick blinked. The name caught his ear, but he didn't process it fully, chalking it up to coincidence. He followed behind, giving the man a hard once-over as they moved into the jet bridge. Inside the jet bridge, Rick whispered to a nearby attendant, making a show of raising his eyebrows. Hey, just a heads up. I think someone slipped into first class who maybe shouldn't be there. Guy in the gray hoodie. I don't think he's supposed to be up here. The attendant's smile remained frozen as she nodded noncommittally, brushing past him without a word. Rick wasn't used to being brushed off like that, especially not by service staff. As he entered the aircraft, the luxury of first class spread before him. Plush leather seats, champagne flutes perched on trays, and the faint scent of cologne and citrus polish. Rick paused in the aisle, scanning for his seat. To his irritation, the man in the hoodie had taken the window seat right next to his. Rick slid into his aisle seat with a grunt, adjusting his briefcase in the overhead bin a bit louder than necessary, hoping to provoke a response. Still nothing. The man had settled in with his hood down now, revealing neatly trimmed hair, a clean-shaven face, and a jawline that looked like it had been sculpted for film. Rick glanced sideways. Something about him felt vaguely familiar, but the arrogance in Rick's mind dismissed it. Celebrities didn't fly commercial, not even in first class. They chartered jets, wore sunglasses indoors, made scenes. This guy was too quiet, too composed. Must be some mid-tier influencer or athlete, he concluded, maybe one of those YouTube boxers trying to stay relevant. Rick exhaled sharply, eager to assert his presence. Long day? He asked. His voice dipped in passive aggression. The man nodded politely without looking. You from LA? Seems like everyone in this cabin is either from LA or pretending they are. The man chuckled softly. Not mocking, not defensive, just lightly amused. It was a sound that should have been unremarkable, but it hit Rick like a challenge. That laugh carried a level of composure he didn't expect, like the kind that comes from being unbothered for a very long time. As passengers continued to board and the noise level rose, Rick watched his seatmate slip his earbuds back in and close his eyes, shutting him out completely. Rick fidgeted. The gate hadn't even closed yet, and already he felt invisible. For a man like him, that was intolerable. He needed dominance, acknowledgement, the last word. He tapped his fingers impatiently against the armrest, already planning how he would get the man's attention again once they were airborne. What Rick didn't notice, though, was how several flight attendants glanced back toward his row after completing their rounds, their eyes subtly flicking to the man in the gray hoodie. One even whispered something to the other before smiling and hurrying back to the galley. Something was off. The air felt thicker than usual, like it was holding a secret. Rick, oblivious to the shifting atmosphere around him, leaned back and sighed loudly, already mentally drafting a passive-aggressive email to the airline about letting unqualified people board first class. He had no idea that he wasn't just sitting next to someone who belonged there. He was sitting next to someone the world knew intimately, someone whose quiet was louder than any insult Rick could craft. The first domino had fallen, and Rick was too smug to hear the rattle of what was coming next. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Rick's growing irritation brewed silently in his chest like a kettle left unattended. The man beside him, still composed, still annoyingly unbothered, had pulled out a tablet and was now casually browsing through what looked like a movie script. Rick craned his neck subtly to peek at the screen, but the angle offered him only fragments: character names, dialogue, scene headings. The formatting was unmistakable, though, and it only fueled his annoyance. Of course, another wannabe actor with delusions of grandeur, probably using a fake name just to see how far he could push his luck. Rick leaned back, folded his arms across his chest, and let out an audible sigh that went unacknowledged. He needed a reaction. He needed validation. Without looking away from the tablet, the man took a sip of his water, his movements smooth and deliberate. It wasn't just that he was calm, it was the kind of calm that came from being above whatever drama Rick was trying to create. The flight ascended smoothly, the usual chimes ringing overhead as seatbelt signs flickered off. As attendants began moving about, Rick seized the opportunity to engage again, this time louder. "Must be nice," he said, gesturing toward the script with a sarcastic smile. "Living out the LA dream. Let me guess, you're in between roles right now." The man slowly turned his head and gave Rick a neutral smile, neither confirming nor denying anything. "Something like that," he replied evenly, then returned his gaze to the screen. Rick chuckled, shaking his head as if he'd heard a joke only he understood. "You know," he continued, "I used to work in talent acquisition briefly. I've seen guys like you come and go. All style, no substance. First-class ticket doesn't buy you credibility." His voice wasn't raised, but the venom in his tone was unmistakable, designed to provoke. The man paused his scrolling and looked over again, his expression unreadable. "I'm just trying to enjoy the flight," he said quietly, a firm boundary drawn without malice. Rick took it as a challenge. "Oh, come on, lighten up. You can't fly with the stars if you can't handle a little turbulence, right?" His laughter filled the quiet between them. The passengers in the rows ahead began to shift subtly, a few glances cast over shoulders. The tension had started to ripple outward. One of the flight attendants passed by and glanced down, catching the awkward energy like a scent in the air. She offered a polite, practiced smile, but her eyes lingered for just a second too long. Rick noticed and smirked, as if vindicated by the attention. "You'd think people would dress for the occasion," he muttered, more to the cabin than to his seatmate. "You're in first class, not a gym lounge." The insult hung in the air like smoke. The man put down his tablet and faced forward, clearly restraining himself. Rick, emboldened by the silence, leaned in again. "Look, I'm just saying there's a certain standard here. I mean, most of us work to get these seats. But hey, maybe you won a contest or something." His words were met not with rebuttal, but a measured breath from the man, who turned his head slowly and met Rick's gaze. "Or maybe I've been working harder than you ever will and just don't need to prove it to anyone," he said with quiet finality. Rick blinked, caught off guard. There was weight behind that sentence, weight that came not from ego, but lived experience. But before he could respond, a soft chime overhead announced beverage service. A different attendant this time, one who looked younger, appeared at their row and greeted the man beside Rick with a tone that was too warm, too familiar. "Would you like the usual, Mr. Jordan?" she asked. Rick's eyebrows twitched. That name again. He turned abruptly, narrowing his eyes at the man beside him, scanning his face with a new suspicion. "Wait, what did she call you?" he asked. "Jordan." The man gave a small shrug, saying nothing. Rick scoffed. Jordan like Michael Jordan? Or is this another Hollywood stage name? He laughed at his own joke. Come on, man. You're not seriously trying to pass yourself off as… Wait. Hold on. Rick suddenly froze, replaying the face in his mind. Not Michael Jordan the athlete. Michael B. Jordan, the actor. The resemblance. The jawline. The voice. He stared harder now, recognition dawning far too late to undo the words already said. No, Rick muttered almost to himself. No way. He looked again, this time truly seeing the man, as if the fog of arrogance had been temporarily lifted. He saw the trademark features, the Hollywood polish hidden beneath casual comfort. His mind scrambled to recall the actor's recent roles, magazine covers, public appearances. He began second-guessing everything, but pride kept him from admitting he'd made a mistake. Rick tried to laugh it off. You know, you really do look like him. That's gotta be intentional, right? I mean, come on, the resemblance is crazy. You could totally pass as Michael B. Jordan. Bet you use that to get into clubs all the time. The man gave no reply, just that same composed silence. Rick shifted in his seat, trying to recalibrate his approach. Listen, he said after a moment. If you are who I think you are, hey, no hard feelings. I was just joking around earlier. It was a desperate pivot, one designed to save face rather than genuinely apologize. But the damage was already done. Around them, more passengers had taken notice. Phones were being tilted subtly upward. A few camera clicks buzzed quietly beneath the surface. Something was building, and Rick was about to find himself at the center of it. The man he'd spent the last hour antagonizing wasn't just any passenger. He was someone the entire cabin, and soon the entire world, would recognize. And Rick's performance, unfortunately, was about to go viral. As the flight reached cruising altitude and the hum of the engines settled into a steady rhythm, an undercurrent of discomfort pulsed subtly through the first-class cabin. Though the passengers reclined into their wide leather seats and sipped on glasses of white wine and cucumber-infused water, more than a few sets of eyes had drifted toward row 2A and 2B. The quiet tension between Rick and the man next to him had ceased being private long ago. While the casual observer might have thought it was just two strangers who weren't getting along, the sharper ones were beginning to piece together the puzzle. A well-dressed couple seated diagonally behind Rick had noticed the passive-aggressive comments from earlier. A teenager across the aisle kept subtly angling his phone, as if trying to capture the scene without drawing attention. But the most perceptive eyes belonged to the flight attendants, especially Simone, a senior crew member who had worked the LA to NYC route for over 7 years and had seen more than her fair share of celebrities traveling incognito. Simone had sensed something was off the moment she walked by the row during drink service and caught a clipped sentence from Rick. Something about people staying in their lane. It wasn't said loudly, but it carried the sharpness of someone trying to provoke rather than converse. At first, she assumed it was just another arrogant executive treating the cabin like his boardroom. She'd met plenty. But as she looked down and made eye contact with the man Rick was speaking to, she blinked. Took her only a second. She didn't squeal or gasp or stutter. She simply tilted her head slightly, smiled politely, and kept moving. But inside, her thoughts were racing. Michael B. Jordan? Was that really him? Dressed so modestly, no entourage, no flash? It wasn't unusual for stars to fly commercial when they wanted to blend in, but it was unusual for them to be harassed by some pompous stranger mid-flight. After returning to the galley, Simone leaned toward her colleague, Jenna, who was preparing a tray of sparkling water and mixed nuts. "Don't look now," Simone whispered. "But I think we've got Michael B. Jordan in 2A. Jenna's eyes widened slightly, then her brows furrowed. "Seriously?" Simone nodded. "And the guy next to him has been running his mouth the entire time like he owns the sky. Totally clueless." Jenna paused, processing this information, and glanced toward the curtain. "I thought he looked familiar when he boarded." "Should we?" Simone raised a hand. "Let's not make a thing of it. He hasn't said anything. He's just letting the other guy dig his own grave." They shared a knowing glance, that quiet, understanding flight attendants develop after years in the air. Reading body language, picking up tension, and knowing exactly when to intervene. Meanwhile, Rick continued his performance, unaware that the audience around him was growing. His voice wasn't as loud as before, but the condescension in his tone remained sharp as glass. He leaned over again, this time to make another jab about movie types trying to stay relevant. Michael said nothing, but the silence now felt different. It felt calculated, strategic. A few rows back, the teenager who had been recording quietly dropped his phone below the seat, fingers flying across the screen. Seconds later, a video was uploading to a social media platform with the caption, "Dude in first class mouthing off to Michael B. Jordan like he doesn't know who he's talking to." In less than 2 minutes, it would begin its journey toward virality. None of them knew yet just how far it would reach. In the cockpit, the lead attendant had quietly been informed. Protocol required that when a public figure was recognized mid-flight, especially one of Michael's stature, they keep security in mind, not because the figure was a threat, but because passengers around them could become unpredictable. The captain wasn't notified yet, but Simone made a mental note to escalate if the situation worsened. She returned to the cabin and did a slow pass, offering warm smiles to each row but letting her gaze linger slightly longer on row 2. She noticed Michael glance up and nod politely at her, then quickly avert his eyes to avoid drawing attention. She understood immediately. He wasn't trying to make a scene. He wanted the situation to resolve on its own. But Rick, still blind to the walls closing in, seemed to believe he was scoring points. "Tell you what," he said, swirling the ice in his glass dramatically. "If you ever do make it big, you might want to invest in some better clothes. First impressions matter, my friend." His smug grin curled as he took a sip, certain he'd landed the final blow. Michael turned slowly, rested his elbow on the armrest, and stared at him. Not with anger, not even with pity, but with something far worse for a man like Rick: indifference. And then he said something so simple, so disarming, it sucked the air from the moment. "You talk a lot," Michael said calmly, "but none of it means anything." The line didn't need to be loud. It wasn't designed to provoke. It was a statement of fact, delivered with surgical precision. And for the first time, Rick had no immediate comeback. The cabin felt still, like the seconds after a lightning flash, when you're waiting for the thunder to hit. Simone, observing from the front, nodded to herself. That was all the confirmation she needed. This wasn't just a passenger who looked like Michael B. Jordan. This was him. And now, everyone else on the plane was slowly catching up to that realization. She walked back to the galley again and picked up the interphone to discreetly alert the crew in the back. "Eyes on 2A. Is confirmed. Don't make a fuss, but we're adjusting our guest protocol." Meanwhile, Rick sat in his seat, suddenly unsure of himself, fiddling with his shirt cuff. Something had shifted, and though he couldn't name it yet, he could feel it. The weight of scrutiny, the silence of power, the unmistakable sense that he'd just made a mistake too big to ignore. It began with the soft shuffle of sneakers and the hesitant creak of a curtain being pulled aside. From the back of the plane, a boy no older than 10 stood frozen at the entrance to first class, clutching a phone in one hand and a small, wrinkled notebook in the other. His curly hair bounced as he peered around nervously, scanning the rows like he was on the verge of backing out. But then he saw him, the man in the gray hoodie, the one who had been so quiet and composed despite the barbs thrown at him by the smug passenger next to him. The boy's eyes lit up with a recognition that was immediate and pure. "Mom!" he whispered over his shoulder, loud enough to carry forward. "That's him. That's Michael B. Jordan." The name cracked open the tension in the cabin like a lightning bolt. A hush fell across first class as heads turned and phones subtly shifted. For a few heartbeats, everything stood still. Rick's face drained of color. He blinked hard, as though trying to reset his vision, suddenly staring at the man beside him with renewed intensity, now searching for what had been in front of him all along. But it was too late. The illusion of anonymity Michael had tried to protect had just been shattered, not by his own doing, but by the unfiltered honesty of a child. The boy took a few steps forward, nervous but determined, and held up the notebook with both hands. "Mr. Jordan, I know it's you. Can I please have an autograph? I loved you in Creed. I've seen it like 20 times. The innocence in his voice disarmed the room, turning what had been an atmosphere thick with discomfort into one of warm realization. Michael looked down, his cool composure momentarily melting into a soft smile. He reached for the notebook and pen, gently taking them from the boy's small hands. "Thanks, man. That means a lot," he said, scribbling his signature with practiced ease. Then he looked the boy in the eye. "You got a favorite scene?" The boy's face lit up even brighter. "The part where you're running through the streets and all the guys on the bikes ride behind you. I always pretend I'm you when I run with my friends." Michael chuckled, clearly touched. "That's a good one." A few chuckles rippled through the cabin, and some passengers began to smile, the heaviness of earlier tensions lifted by this unexpected moment of connection. Then came the mother, appearing behind her son with an apologetic look. "I'm so sorry," she said, hands raised in surrender. "He snuck up here the second I closed my eyes." Michael waved it off. "No problem at all. You've got a brave one there." Rick, meanwhile, looked like he had swallowed a shard of ice. He leaned back in his seat, gripping his armrest, trying to disappear into the upholstery. He glanced around, realizing now that nearly every passenger was looking at him, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled judgment. His earlier insults echoed in his own mind now like a chorus of regret. "Influencer. Cosplay. Doesn't belong here." Each word had come from his mouth. Each word now felt like a bullet ricocheting back in his direction. But what sealed the moment wasn't the boy or the growing realization among passengers. It was the mother's reaction when she looked at Rick. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she made the connection. "Wait," she said, her voice low but cutting. "Were you the one giving him a hard time this whole time?" She wasn't loud, but she didn't need to be. The tone alone shifted the mood again. Simone, watching from the galley, stepped forward slightly, ready to intervene if needed. Rick opened his mouth, then closed it. His mind raced for excuses, misunderstandings, deflections, but none of them felt credible anymore. I didn't know who he was," he muttered. "It's not what it looked like." The mother tilted her head. "So if he wasn't famous, the disrespect would be fine?" she asked coolly. Rick's jaw clenched. Michael, still calm, passed the notebook back to the boy. "It's all good," he said softly, defusing the moment before it escalated. "Let's just enjoy the flight." But even that gesture of grace made Rick squirm deeper into his seat. The kindness only made his pettiness look worse. The boy and his mother returned toward economy, the cabin watching them like the closing scene of a powerful film. As they disappeared behind the curtain, the silence that followed was louder than any confrontation. The shift had fully taken place. Michael B. Jordan wasn't just recognized, he was elevated, and Rick had been publicly diminished. Passengers began whispering. One woman near the front turned to her husband and murmured, "I thought he looked familiar. That guy had no idea who he was sitting next to." Another man shook his head, whispering, "I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up online." Rick could feel the weight of every murmur. His skin crawled with self-consciousness, a sensation unfamiliar to someone so used to control. His position as the dominant voice in the row had been taken from him, not with aggression, but with poise, humility, and the undeniable power of reputation. Michael put his earbuds back in, leaned his head against the window, and stared into the clouds beyond. He didn't need revenge. The truth had already done its work. And Rick was now left with the quiet shame of knowing that the man he tried to diminish had shown him more patience than he deserved. There would be no final jab, no reclaiming of the upper hand. The curtain had fallen, and the scene had changed forever. The hum of the aircraft engines blended with the soft rustle of passengers shifting in their seats. But the mood in first class had shifted into something electric, a suspended silence wrapped in the anticipation of something undeniable. What had begun as a subtle moment, a child's innocent excitement, was now transforming into collective realization. Murmurs traveled like ripples in still water, each one building on the last as passengers nudged their companions, and pointed subtly toward row 2. The name had been spoken, the identity suspected, but now the whispers were turning into quiet confirmations. It's really him. That's Michael B. Jordan, no question. He was just at the Oscars last month. The man who had tried to remain anonymous was now being placed, remembered, connected to moments on screens, interviews, headlines, and magazine covers. Even those who weren't fans recognized his face. It was a strange thing to watch someone become unmistakable all at once, without saying a word. Simone, the senior flight attendant, returned to the row, no longer just as a server but as a quiet guardian of the cabin's unfolding narrative. She leaned down beside Michael and spoke with respectful warmth. "Mr. Jordan, I just wanted to say thank you for your patience. If there's anything you need, anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." Michael looked at her and gave a small nod. "Appreciate it," he replied, his voice calm but kind, a tone that spoke of experience with these moments. Across the aisle, a man holding a tablet quickly lowered it when Michael glanced his way. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, unsure if the moment called for applause or silence. Rick sat frozen in his seat, hands clasped tightly in his lap, his earlier arrogance now wilted into palpable shame. His lips were drawn in a hard line, and the occasional glance from fellow passengers struck him like darts. One passenger, a woman in her 40s seated in row 3, broke the hush with a soft, admiring voice. "I loved you in Just Mercy," she said, loud enough to be heard, but still gentle. Michael turned and offered a grateful smile, a simple nod in acknowledgement. The spell was officially broken. A few more voices chimed in, complimenting his roles, his work, his impact. He didn't revel in it. He didn't posture or play into it. He simply accepted it with the same grace he had maintained since the moment Rick opened his mouth. But what struck the cabin most was that Michael never once mentioned who he was. He had let others arrive at the truth on their own. He didn't correct Rick. He didn't retaliate. He let the truth, in all its clarity, expose what arrogance had tried to dismiss. Rick finally shifted, desperate to reframe the moment before it spiraled further. "I didn't mean anything by it," he mumbled, attempting a laugh. I didn't recognize you. My bad." He chuckled again, a hollow, brittle sound. "Honestly, I thought you were just some guy trying to look like him." But no one was laughing with him. Not anymore. His words, now that the truth had surfaced, sounded desperate, like excuses gasping for air in a room where the oxygen had been drained. He reached for his glass, his hand trembling slightly, then placed it back down without taking a sip. The truth had done what Michael's silence couldn't. It cornered Rick with reality. There was no misinterpretation, no plausible deniability left. Everyone had seen what happened. Everyone had heard how Rick spoke to him when he believed he was a nobody. And then, like the final punctuation in a sentence that had been building for hours, another flight attendant leaned into the row with a soft smile. "Mr. Jordan," she said, "we just wanted to say it's an honor having you with us today. Your presence means a lot." Michael nodded again, still not basking in the attention but acknowledging it with that same quiet composure. Rick turned his head toward the window, unable to meet anyone's gaze, especially not Michael's. The shame didn't just come from being wrong. It came from realizing that the way he treated people wasn't based on principle but on perception. He had disrespected a stranger because he thought he could, and now he had to live with the fact that it had been done in front of witnesses, and worse, to someone beloved. The curtain between first class and economy was drawn back slightly as another curious child peeked through, held gently by his mother, who whispered, "Not now, sweetie." The boy blinked, wide-eyed. "But Mom, that's Killmonger," he whispered, referencing Michael's role in Black Panther. That one word sent a low, appreciative chuckle through the cabin. Even Michael smiled wider this time, not just amused, but touched. Rick, meanwhile, felt the final blow not through words but through the unmistakable shift in energy. He wasn't just the guy who got it wrong. He was the guy who had shown who he really was when he thought no one of importance was watching. And now the person he thought was unimportant had turned out to be a man the entire world respected. The rest of the cabin eased into a new normal. Conversations resumed, drinks were refilled, and some passengers sent discreet texts or opened social media apps to see if anyone else had caught what just happened. But for Rick, the flight had changed course entirely. His internal turbulence had just begun, and no amount of altitude could distance him from what he had just revealed about himself. The truth had come out, unforced and undeniable, and in doing so, it had shifted the entire narrative. Michael didn't have to say a word about what Rick had done. He didn't have to demand an apology or lecture anyone about respect. The reality spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. And as the jet cut through the clouds, it carried with it the weight of that truth, heavy and unforgettable. The remainder of the flight unfolded like an unspoken reckoning, the kind that didn't need grand gestures or dramatic showdowns to feel profound. First class was quieter now, but not in a way that suggested boredom or rest. It was the silence of reflection, of passive judgment, of collective awareness settling over the cabin like a soft fog. No one needed to say what they were thinking. Every passenger knew exactly what they had just witnessed. Rick remained rooted in his seat like a statue, too proud to apologize and too ashamed to speak. He stared out the window as though the answer to his humiliation might be written in the clouds. But the only reflection staring back at him was the version of himself everyone else had seen. Meanwhile, Michael remained the picture of grace, leaning back in his seat, earbuds in, eyes closed, not asleep, but detached in a way that made it clear he had already moved on. His silence, once interpreted as passivity, had become something far more powerful: control. But fate wasn't done exacting its poetic justice. About 30 minutes before landing, Simone returned to row 2 with a calm, professional smile and crouched slightly beside Michael. "Mr. Jordan," she said gently, "there's a young fan in the back who's flying for the first time. He's been asking non-stop if he could just shake your hand. Would it be all right if he came up here for a minute?" Michael opened his eyes and nodded warmly. "Of course." Moments later, a boy no older than 8 appeared from the economy cabin, holding his father's hand tightly, eyes wide with nervous excitement. "Hi, Mr. Jordan," he said quietly, barely able to keep his voice steady. Michael reached out and gave him a firm handshake and a smile. "First flight, huh? You doing okay?" The boy nodded, starstruck, then turned to look around the cabin like it was a castle and he had just entered the throne room. Simone stepped closer and gently gestured toward the empty aisle seat across from Michael. "Would it be all right if he sat with you for a few minutes? His dad will be right behind him." Michael motioned for the boy to take the seat beside him, the same seat Rick had been occupying just moments earlier before he excused himself to the restroom. When Rick returned to see someone else in his seat and Michael warmly speaking with the young fan, he froze. Simone met him mid-aisle, her tone polite but firm. "Sir, we've made a temporary adjustment with the seating to accommodate a special guest. You're welcome to take the crew jump seat near the galley for the remainder of the flight. We appreciate your understanding." Rick looked at her in disbelief, his mouth slightly open, but there was no room for protest. Not when the cabin had witnessed everything. Not when it was obvious that the child was causing no disruption. Not when the person he had antagonized was now graciously doing what Rick had failed to do the entire flight: treat others with dignity. He walked slowly past the rows of eyes watching him, past the whispering passengers, past the recording phones. Each step to the back of the cabin was heavier than the last, and when he finally reached the jump seat and sat down, it was not as a successful executive or frequent flyer. It was as the humbled man who had revealed his own ignorance at 30,000 feet. As the plane began its descent into New York, the pilot made a cheerful announcement, noting the smooth weather and early arrival. In the front cabin, the boy clutched the seat's armrests, grinning as Michael explained how the landing gear worked, what the lights meant, and what to expect when they touched down. The moment felt sincere, pure, and intimate, and those who watched it unfold saw something they wouldn't forget. Here was a man who could have reacted with justified anger but chose kindness instead. Here was a celebrity who didn't demand attention but earned it through patience. And here was the same man who, despite being insulted, dismissed, and mocked, still made space for others in a way his critic never could. The applause that erupted upon landing wasn't just for the touchdown. It was for the integrity that had flown the entire length of the country in silence and then spoke volumes in actions. The aftermath came quickly. The video that had been uploaded mid-flight hit viral status before most passengers had even claimed their baggage. By the time Rick stepped off the plane, it had already spread across social media platforms with captions like, "Arrogant exec disrespects Michael B. Jordan mid-flight, gets humbled in real time," and "Poetic justice in the sky. Watch this guy's ego implode." News outlets picked it up within hours. Hashtags trended. Flight attendants posted cryptic emojis and tweets. Even celebrities weighed in, many of them applauding Michael for handling the situation the way only a true class act could. Meanwhile, Rick's name, quickly identified by an eager LinkedIn sleuth, was plastered across threads and forums. His company issued a brief statement distancing themselves from his behavior and announcing a formal review. He was suspended pending investigation, his inbox flooded with outrage, his carefully curated online presence cracking under the weight of his own arrogance. But the story didn't end with his fall. It ended with Michael walking through the terminal, hoodie pulled up again, duffel bag over his shoulder, pausing briefly to sign one last autograph for the airport janitor who whispered shyly, "Thank you for how you handled that." Michael nodded, smiled, and slipped into the crowd, disappearing as quietly as he had arrived. There were no press conferences, no social media rants, no pointed statements, just the quiet reminder that true power doesn't need to shout. It simply endures. Rick would go on to learn many lessons from that flight, but none more powerful than this. Respect costs nothing, but the lack of it can cost you everything. And sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that choose not to speak, until the world does it for them.